Archive as process, construction, and rehearsal. And this conversation is between Varun Nayar and Arpan Mukherjee. It's around the archive as process rather than a fixed entity. Both practitioners engage deeply with photographic histories. Varun, through his work as director of Impart, formerly Map Academy, and he was also the managing editor of Aperture. And Arpan, through a materially grounded practice that draws on archival research and 19th century photographic processes. Arpan is also the associate professor and head of printmaking at Kola Bhavan at Visva Bharati University. Their practices intersect in their attention to how images are shaped over time through repetition, reworking, and the conditions of their preservation or loss. Questions of authorship, technique, and context emerge through these engagements, particularly in relation to found material and artist archives. I invite Varun and Arpan to take this further, thinking through how absence operates within photographic archives and how these gaps might be approached not as limitations, but as sites of inquiry.
Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here for this symposium, and thank you to Alakananda and the Archival Matters team for inviting me to participate. Ahead of this conversation between me and Arpan, I just wanted to situate some of my thinking within the broader prompts that we've been discussing about absent archives. The program asks us to think about photographic archives not simply as records of what exists, but as forms shaped equally by what is missing, fragmented, unrecorded, or difficult to access. The archive here is not treated as a stable repository of knowledge, but as a site structured by gaps. It raises questions of how archives are built in the face of those gaps and how we might work alongside absence rather than simply attempting to resolve it. What I want to briefly suggest today is that one way of approaching archival absence is not by looking primarily for what is lost or incomplete, but by looking closely at what sits just outside official visibility, spaces of preparation, rehearsal, and intimacy. If photographs emerge from a relationship or contract between the photographer, subject, and viewer, then the archive extends that relationship across time. Archives are by definition constructions. Their meanings emerge not from any single image, but in the broader tableau of connections they assemble through duration. From this perspective, the archive becomes less a site of resolution and more of an ongoing negotiation, where instead of finished narratives, histories appear as traces of processes still unfolding. This approach has helped me structure my own engagements with photographic archives, primarily as a writer and editor, pushing me beyond the seemingly definite and factual aboutness of such material and towards the structures that render it legible. There are, of course, many contemporary thinkers who have approached the contingent nature of archives, but one way that I've been thinking about this problem recently, and I'm sort of using this presentation as an excuse to think out loud, is through a concept borrowed from dramaturgy rather than from art history. The idea of regions of performance, first articulated by the American sociologist Erving Goffman. In his 1956 book, The Presentation of Self in Everyday Life, Goffman describes social life as structured through spaces of performance, or regions of performance. He distinguishes between front stage spaces, where individuals present themselves in coherent and socially legible ways, and backstage spaces where those performances are prepared, adjusted, contradicted, and loosened. Goffman was not suggesting that backstage spaces reveal some sort of pure authenticity, behind the public performance. In fact, they too remain structured by social expectations and governed by power. What changes is not the presence of the performance, but its register. Although he was writing about everyday interaction rather than photography, this framework offers a useful way for us to think about our encounters with archives. If exhibitions, books, and canonical images operate as front stages for cultural history, archives frequently expose the backstage conditions through which those histories are rehearsed and sustained. In this context and in the context of the symposium, I wanted to briefly bring in two photographic archives in particular to flesh this idea out a bit more. The first is that of the photographer Ketki Sheth, who many of you may be quite familiar with, and who, beginning in the 1980s, gained remarkable access to film sets in Bombay and Madras. Over several years, she photographed actors, extras, technicians, and crew members across moments of rehearsal and rest, largely in black and white and largely outside the spectacular frames through which cinema is usually consumed. These photographs, some of them displayed at a recent exhibition at Photo Inc. in Delhi, form an important visual record of Indian cinema at a particular historical moment. But they also are shaped by a kind of access and intimacy that is less possible today. I first came across these images through Sheth in 2023. At the time, as the COVID crisis was waning globally, she, like many artists, had been looking back at their archives with fresh eyes. After seeing the film set work, I commissioned the writer Eva Dikshit for a story on it for the 2024 issue of Aperture, where I was an editor at the time. On the surface, Sheth's photographs appear to show us what cinema usually hides: actors resting between takes, extras waiting on the margins, technicians absorbed in repetitive labor, moments of boredom or exhaustion that sit far from the fantasy of the silver screen. Rather than revealing some hidden truth behind the camera, these images show us how cinematic identities are maintained across spaces that are supposedly private or preparatory. The people in these photographs are rarely fully off stage. Even in moments of rest, there is an ongoing calibration of presence, of posture, expression, and readiness. The film set in this context is not cleanly divided into front stage and backstage. It is a continuum of performance. And Sheth's archive does not simply document this, it is produced through it. Her photographs exist because of sustained access, trust, and repeated return. The archive is not built from spectacle, but from duration. This is relevant to how we think about absence as well. What is absent from dominant histories of cinema may not necessarily always be hidden. It can often simply be unglamorous, repetitive, or structurally peripheral. Sheth's images give form to those zones of near visibility. Approaching the backstage from a different direction is another archive from a few decades earlier. That of Jyoti Bhatt, the artist, printmaker, and photographer associated with the Faculty of Fine Arts at MSU Baroda, where he studied and later taught in the late 1950s and onwards. Bhatt's archive at the Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore spans nearly 90,000 negatives, which are still being processed and digitized today. Among these are the artist's photographs of his contemporaries, teachers, friends, and other practitioners, which was the subject of a 2023 exhibition and catalog that I had worked on. This portion of the larger archive in particular sits somewhere between documentation, collaboration, and self-conscious staging. Bhatt's photographs are now often treated as historical records of India's post-independence art world. Even though they were made from within that world by someone deeply embedded in it. His portraits are not made behind the scenes or in any literal sense, and yet they are deeply backstage images in Goffman's terms. Bhatt's subjects, artists, teachers, peers, are acutely aware of the camera. They pose, they play, they collaborate in the making of the image. These are not candid revelations of inner selves. They are acts of self-preservation. But crucially, they are acts of preservation within a community, at a moment when that community was actively shaping a post-colonial cultural identity. In Bhatt's archive, the portraits become a space of rehearsal. Artists are not just being documented, they are participating in the construction of how they will enter history. The archive is not something assembled later, it is being formed in real time through acts of posing, refusal, humor, and repetition. Bhatt himself occupies a particularly complex position here. He is simultaneously an artist, an archivist, and a subject. His self-portraits make this explicit. The archive does not sit outside him, it includes him. The backstage in this case is not hidden from view, it is shared, negotiated, and acknowledged. At first glance, these archives appear quite different. One circulates through the machinery of cinema and the other through studios, classrooms, and artistic communities. But I want to propose that both may also be thought through a shared conceptual lens. Seeing these archives side by side, what emerges is not a single model of the backstage, but a shared attentiveness to how identities and histories are sustained through ongoing performance. One operates within a massive cultural industry and the other within a relatively intimate artistic milieu. But both resist the idea of history as something clean, finished, and even fully visible. This brings me back to the idea of absent archives that we're all engaging with this weekend. One of the key questions of the program is how we work with archives that are incomplete, uneven, or shaped by structural erasure. Thinking of the archive as a backstage gives us a new dimension to this question. Instead of asking how we fill gaps, we ask how archives function as spaces of preparation, dialogue, and selective visibility. Archives are not simply places we visit to retrieve meaning. They are activated every time they are edited, exhibited, written about, or recontextualized. Each of those returns produces a new possibility. What Seth and Bhatt's images offer us are not hidden truths behind cultural production, but alternative ways of staying with process. How archival history is something that is lived, rehearsed, and continually reperformed, often in spaces just out of view. Thinking about archives as a backstage allows us to acknowledge absence not as a failure or an impediment, but as a condition of making and remembering. It invites us to look at archives, an archival work, as an ongoing negotiation with what can and cannot be brought into view. Thank you.
So before coming to this point today, me and Varun has multiple sessions of discussions earlier, and we eventually came up to this title, that archive as process, construction, and rehearsal. Because these are the, I believe these are the key areas what we found are common, and then I think these questions are also the key questions to interpret both of our works. I'm here to show my works and to explain my ways of looking at archive through my own practice. My practice engages with photography not simply as image making, but as a way of thinking through history, memory, materials, and process. So history, memory, material, and process, these are the key areas through which I try to intervene to the kind of practice which I work with. I often work with archival photographs and early photographic techniques as a material, particularly those rooted in 19th century practices. What interests me is how photographs operate not as fixed historical documents, but as unstable objects that continue to shift in meaning through time, context, perspective, and acts of making. This is where the rehearsal comes, because we come back again and again. I think my archives, I think of the archive not as a static repository of the past, but as an active site, a space of construction, rehearsal, and negotiations. In this sense, archival images are not complete. They remain open, contingent, and capable of being reactivated through contemporary engagement. When I return to archival images through my own photographic processes, what shift in is not only the meaning of the images, but also my position in relation towards it. In this particular image, what you can see, the left one is a kind of an archival images which I have collected, and then how it has been represented, reworked. The act of reworking becomes a way of entering into a dialogue with the image, one that is shaped by present concerns, personal memory, and material interventions. So here, I have printed those images on a leaf. It's called Rabon Lata in Bengali. It's basically an invasive plant, creeper, and that invades everything. These images begin to function as what I call living images, continuously generating new meaning rather than remaining fixed as in historical evidences. So this particular images you'll see in this slide presentation only that reprinted in multiple ways, re-intervene in multiple methods by incorporating materials and by and the only sole reason was to recontextualize it. Many of my works emerge from the photo archive of Studio Goppo. We have a photo archive, we have collected it, which is both personal and working archive. Projects such as Dewdrops, which was earlier projects, the title was Dewdrops, or Prastav, drew from the found and inherited images and re-engaged them through process like weight collodion, gum printing, and all these earlier processes. In Prastav, which is this particular work, where I have used, this particular archive was of marriage proposals. The photographs I have collected from the local studios of marriage proposals from 70s, 80s, and 90s primarily. These portraits were been, I have collected. Altered digitally, removed the eyeballs, and started questioning the gaze of photographs which is purposed for marriage proposal and the objectification of it. This was exhibited in the last show where, these were all printed. And then I asked the viewers to interact with those images. The point was that they were supposed to write down, they were supposed to make the eyeballs, which were not there, which was blank. But they started making graffitis on the portrait, on the glass surface. And that turned to a very interesting way that how we look at gaze on the other way around. This interpretation was very interesting on the other way around. My engagement with 19th century photographic processes is central to this practice. Technique, such as ambrotype, albumin print, weight plate collodion, are not simply aesthetic choices. They carry within them a specific histories and technologies, labor, and representations. Working through these methods slows down the act of image making and reintroduce a tactile, physical relationship with the photographic surfaces. And that is what I specifically enjoy, and that is what the process I contextualize with it. This slowness is important. It allows the image to emerge gradually, making the process visible and experiential. It also centers a continuity with the historical conditions of photography, enabling a form of embodied dialogue with its past. Through this, I'm interested in how photographic processes themselves can function as archives, holding within them traces of time, use, and transformations. This particular work is IR36. IR36 is a breed of rice, hybrid rice variety. And this particular work is a kind of a work which is around 60 feet long, panorama. And while I was working with this, I was documenting the rural landscapes from village to the city by using a weight plate collodion. So I had to carry all chemicals, tent, darkroom tent, and everything, all of it to the field. And I was trying to record the landscape, the changes of the landscape and what exactly happened now. This through a road, 8-kilometer road, which links to a village, to the city, to the nearby city. This is a fragment of that particular panoramic work. In my practice, the politics of photography emerges across multiple levels. In the material process, and here you can see that the left one is I was making collodion. In the act of looking and in the circulation of images by reworking archival materials and historical techniques. I attempt to expose and question these embedded structures rather than reproduce them uncritically. So there was no need to reproduce collodion as a material. Collodion is a primary material to make photographs. But then when I look at this material, this particular material has a very long history of our colonial time. Ships which were coming from England to India, they refused to take it because collodion is an explosive material. But this was the primary material to make images, to make photographs in 19th century. So in India, people started developing that collodion, but there were certain other technical issues, and then there were problems, all of it. There were fire problems, issues with accidents and all. But eventually, people started making collodion. Uh, so that was a kind of an history which I thought to relocate that with the kind of a landscapes I'm making. So I started making my own collodion, and these are the images which you can see been created with that. I also think of the archive as a kind of backstage space, a place where images are not yet fixed, where they are rehearsed, altered, and negotiated. This backstage exists in multiple locations within my practice. In the archive itself, in the dark room, and in the repeated act of making the remarking images. So this is the kind of an images which I have received. I got it from a family album in one of the villages where I was working. These were abundant. I just picked it up. I also picked up the broken ceramic tiles, and those broken ceramic tiles was the reminiscence of those the houses which has been abandoned by the people who have shifted to migrated to city. And I thought, okay, let's see how that forms. So I started superimposing those images on those tiles through a process called dust-on process. And dust-on is a photoceramic process, and photoceramic is a process which has a very long history, a very long history, because it was super expensive at certain point of time. And it was being considered that one of the finest method of reproducing photograph and keeping the photographs in 19th century. So the nicheness of this particular process, and then how you are how you're making those images of family album on a broken tiles through the same methods, I believe that was a kind of a methodology which I was trying to take in. Works such as the X-ray plate, which is this one, negatives, where images change over time due to chemical reactions, or my photo objects made with silver gelatin on glass, or photogravure plates on copper, emphasizes this instability. So this element of instability is a kind of a backstage which happens. These works resist the idea of the photograph as a final resolved images. Instead, they remain in a state of becoming, subject to time, material transformations, and decay. Uh, from the first image, which on the leaf, that is also carrying the similar idea of decaying. Uh, absence absence is also central to this approach. Rather than trying to fill gaps in the archive or reconstruct a complete narrative, I'm interested in working with absence as a condition of image making. Um, This is a small video. Missing information ensures and fragments become productive spaces, inviting speculations, interpretations, and new forms of visual thinking. So the moment this is the moment when a photographer or an artist who enjoy probably the most, the moment when image appears. And before this appearance of the images, the doubts are there. The the doubts of getting an images, how it will be. It will be dark or no, or you won't get an images. In this way, my work attempts to hold a tension between past and present without collapsing one into the other. The use of historical processes does not aim to recreate the past nostalgia, but to create friction, allowing historical distances and contemporary urgency to the context. Alongside my artistic practice, so so it also involves the other research where I look for new photosensitive material, or where I'm making simply a chemical which is sensitive to light, like ferric oxalate. That is a super elusive chemical which you won't get very easily in the market. So you need to make your own chemical. And the process of making a photosensitive chemical, which is very interesting because all the time you need to take care of that chemical. That is sensitive to light. You can't do it in white light. You have to do it in the dark room. You have to take care of that chemical. Uh, so the process of making a chemical which has the possibility to produce an image is very interesting. Alongside my practice, teaching and collaborative work form an important extension of my engagement with archives. Through workshops, shared experiments, and collective inquiry, the archives become something that is not owned but experienced and reinterpreted together. These spaces of learning functions as another form of archival practices, one that is based on dialogue, transmission, and participations rather than preservations alone. Ultimately, my works approaches photography as a way of rethinking our relationship to history in the present. By working with archival images, historical processes, and material transformations, I try to keep photographs open, allowing them to remain active, unstable, and alive across time. Thank you.
I was thinking we might engage with some of the themes that you brought up, because I think they have a relevance beyond just your practice. But I think it's interesting to explore some specific questions related to your practice. So I was making notes on that that relate to the broader theme. So 19th century processes, of course, as we've learned, is a very significant through line in your practice. But these are, as you've said, these are historically loaded methods. They come with a lot of baggage that you are very explicit about addressing. So there's this selection process of why choose these methods, and there are scientific, visual, aesthetic considerations there. But there's a very clear understanding that when photographs produced and prints produced with these methods, they should evoke a certain feeling and a relationship to history. At first glance, what a viewer might see in one of your works is a photograph that opens up to another time on the surface if they're not sort of looking just at the content. And you sort of are able to manipulate that initial encounter. One thing that may come up in future sessions is this idea of the aesthetic of the archive, whether that's old pictures, filing cabinets, redacted documents. There's this initial impression that comes with photographs from the 19th century that you're trying to play around with and upturn.
Yeah, of course.
So maybe you can talk a little bit more about selecting, engaging with these materials and how that might relate to a viewer's impressions.
Well, to start with, Akshay have shown one slide of people of India, and I think he has briefly mentioned the kind of an paleness, the kind of an standardized visuals that been created. So in 19th century, when this volume of books been produced, it was produced with a process of wet plate collodion. And it's very interesting to note that wet plate collodion is colorblind. So technically it is a colorblind process. It cannot see red, yellow. It cannot make differences beyond blue and ultraviolet ray. So it can see only ultraviolet ray and blue, and it can't see rest of the colors. Now, a fairer person, in Indian context, may be represented, if I click those images through that process, may be represented as a dark-skinned person. So the kind of the skin color on the other way around, if you look at photography as a kind of an indexical process, and then if you look at these documentations, then this is the kind of a gap where you can play. And these photographs been captured, printed, documented, circulated as a proof, as an evidence. So in my work, I thought this is a kind of an interesting point when I align it with, let's say, in 2012, the market value of Fair and Lovely was around 3,000 crore rupees in India. So swimming pool full of Fair and Lovely, you go swim and come back, and then you will be fairer. I started looking at these products, and then started wondering what exactly, how things started working. And then I asked my students that if they are comfortable to get photographed with the same process. I showed them the images, I showed them the Peoples of India illustrations, photographs, narrated them the whole thing, had a conversation with them, and then I came up with a project called Fairer People equal to Beautiful People equal to Powerful People. And then I started offering them talcum powder, multani mitti, Vaseline, and all of it, which was like normal household things. And then I asked them, okay, if you apply talcum powder on your face, you will be fairer, because that's white, and white Nickelodeon can recognize you. So people started, performing through those materials. They started engaging with those materials and with the idea of it. And I recorded them. I eventually came up with photographs of portraits of these students. So that is a kind of a way how I engage with the historical baggage which this methods is coming up with, and then how I reinterpreted it. This is one example, but then I think as an artist, my tendency is that kind of reconnect the historical baggage of the process, material, the way it been curated, the way it been, circulated. And I try to look at it again and again through that methodologies. So the same thing I talked about, the cotton, from a cotton ball, how you make a collodion, and then how that collodion can be used to make images. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Just on that last point, and something that I noticed, I'm sure many of us noticed, was this just sheer variety of materials you work with in order to make photographs. I'm thinking about the ceramic tiles. There's also another series of yours that I know where you use the red iron ore dust for photographs, pinhole camera photographs of a mining town in Odisha. I think I'm thinking about materiality. You know, there's this idea of the conceptual historical baggage of the 19th century photograph, but you incorporate a lot of materials. There's an experimental approach to bringing in different materials. So whether it comes to just the archive or your practice, to what extent is material a narrative tool for you? How much of it does it tell a story?
So, as you refer back to that particular work in Barbil, so Barbil is one of the largest iron ore mines in India, and if you go to the town called Barbil in Orissa, you will see that it's a mining town of iron ore, and you will see that all the leaves of the place is red. All the grasses are red. Everything is red, coated with a fine powder of iron ore. So I started working with that, and I went there, I made the landscape of Barbil with a pinhole camera, and then printed them with the same red iron ore which I collected from the mines. So while I was trying to collecting the red dust from mining, I was also pointing it out from which locations I have collected. And then the collection itself became a kind of a material which addressed the whole idea of collecting and then how you're preserving through the images. So I was making the images, I was collecting the dust, and then I was trying to incorporate that dust to printing the images as a pigment. So these prints, I do not know about the life of these prints because these are all printed with iron ore, but then, but that was a kind of a methodology that how you, it's almost geotagging of nowadays, that how you geotag it. So I started doing that, collecting the dust from that particular place, clicked a photograph, and then started printing that with that same kind of a material. So it's probably, it's also a methodology of archiving. It's also a methodology of how you interpret this.
That geotagging point is interesting. Are you trying to say that it allows you to freeze sort of a moment in time using
Yeah,
the
absolutely.
material?
But it also carries, whenever I see those images, I believe it also reminds me that, okay, I have collected that dust from that particular geographical location. So wherever it goes with that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, yeah.
this particular body of work been shown in Brazil, where again the kind of an iron ore mining is there, and then that was also carrying that similar kind of an value, and started exchanging that idea of it.
Mhm.
So
Yeah.
I believe Barbie will travel to that place as well whenever it goes. It's not only the image, but it is the material itself.
Yeah. I was really struck by that work. I know you didn't have it on screen, but I think it's representative of a lot of your works. And I had read this book a few years ago by Susan Shipley. She's a researcher, somewhat associated with forensic architecture as well in London. She has this idea called material witness, where she speaks about the evidentiary role of matter in registering, in her case, registering or archiving, in the examples that she gave, violence and conflict. And she sort of asks us to sort of think more broadly about what visual information and archival information can look like and the tactility of it. So I was thinking a lot about what is incorporated into the photographic moment when I was looking at that work as well, although it was in a different context. I think I'll focus on one more theme that we discussed, and then perhaps we can open it up to any questions from the audience. We talked about authorship and positionality. I think a topic that will, I'm sure, come up again in future panels. Social position plays an important role in the archives that I discussed, social and community position. I've been fortunate to be able to speak to both its authors or originating artists. But you work pretty frequently with found imagery, which is quite complex because authorship is a little bit more tricky. How do you see those complications of found imagery in relation to your practice, particularly with a project like Prasthav? How do you even go about finding, searching for found imagery and incorporating it into your practice?
So most of the cases, these images or these photographs which are I work with, or our archive is, these are abundant images. So there are weird stories about it. Like I found bunch of the photographs with rotten passport, letters, telegram, just the opposite side of my house in the bush, because somebody who was there who was taking care of this whole archive, and she died. And after that, somebody came, vacated the house, thrown out all the things, and then suddenly I discover it. So that is a kind of found objects which is part of the first Dewdrops series. Uh, Now, who is the author of that? I do not know who has taken the photographs. I do not know whose photograph been taken. Uh, it was lying down somewhere. And then I started altering the identity of it. I started reinterpreting the whole thing. So this was the primary questions. But then the question became critical when I started working with the marriage proposal images. The images which has been, captured by a studio photographer. And he started selling it off. So I collected it from the Kawadiwala or from somewhere, or I went to their spaces. The person died, and then I just found full bag full of photographs. But the photographs were of someone. These all were portraits, and these portraits has their own identity. There was a real person who might be very old now, but then there is a real person who has its own identity. So does this photograph belong to that person whose photograph it is? Or is it belongs to the photographer who clicked it? Or is it belongs to me who have collected? So these questions were there, and when I started removing the eyeball, it was not only the gaze, the question of gaze, but it was also a question of removing the identity. That if you remove the eyeball, then it's a new identity. And I will show you. When I exhibited this work recently in Calcutta, it allowed people to, the people were supposed to make the eyeballs, but what they did, they made this drawing, and there was a signature down there where I put my signature. They just cut it over through it, and they put their own signature. And that was a kind of a very valid question, whether this work belongs to me or somebody else. And the interesting part was there that these were all this whiteboard markers, which you can remove it with there's no glue, no gum. So you can remove it and you can rework on top of it. So constantly that authorship was changing, and certain other things were coming up. That was very interesting to me, and I think that also opens up my mind that how do I look at the gaze and the question of authorship.
Yeah. You told me that signature story, and I thought it was interesting. And even just using this term found imagery, I've always had a little bit of a complicated relationship because it is a product of our engagement and attention rather than the condition or origin of the actual imagery. Kind of Akshay, like you were saying, archives are embarrassingly public. So it's almost like we are the second half, and our engagement activates it or makes it or defines it into something. I could go on, but let's stop there. In case anybody has any further questions, we have some time for that. Yeah.
It's a general question. I think because I see as a kind of bridge. Did you talk to Kate Key about her photo studio work by any chance? And
yeah.
The photo studio as this sort of space, Studio Gopo, the traveling studio, this sort of space of production of photography or so.
Yeah, I did. Not as extensively because that work has sort of, I think it got featured in the New Yorker not so long ago, but it's been featured around. So I've been familiar with that work as much as it's sort of these photographs and that one specifically of Meenakshi Seshadri in the cover of that piece that I was kind of blown away by. What she did say was what links this series and the photo studio series is the idea of labor. She's been quite kind of interested always in unpacking this idea of where the work of images and what we visualize, whether that's in cinema or in studio photographs or photographs for personal mementos. So there are traces of that labor in the photo studio series and here as well with the Spot Boys and everyone else that are in some cases dominating the screen. So yeah, I did speak to her about it, but that was an interesting connection she made about labor. Even with the Siddhi community, her series with that, there is sort of a through line of labor that goes through. So it's something that she hadn't necessarily linked to this series in particular, and I think she's still finding a shape for it, but it was interesting to see in context to those other series.
Yeah, thank you. I'm very curious to learn, your relationship that you have with the material aspect of that earlier process. And it feels, looking at your practice, that you are also archiving it in your lived experience. And then I'm thinking about the images that you are bringing into that archive. And it's an abandoned process, largely 19th century abandoned process and abandoned images. And it's not an easy marriage of these two here. So if you can reflect on that, why and how is it that these two come together in your practice?
I think as a process, the term called abundancy is a kind of a way of looking. We never call painting as abundant process. Painting, applying color, it had started from the cave paintings time. So we never found that painting is an abundant process. I think these are processes. This is abundant in terms of commercial photography. So I'm not expecting her to come with a wooden camera and click the images, document it in plate Clodian now. But then, so that's the commercial aspect of it. But when you look at photo making, then things are different. I think then it is more important that how do I negate that standardization of photographs? That somebody sitting in New York will decide what color my image will be. I am not buying that. So I decide my color, I decide my surface, and I decide what kind of a material it will be. In terms of aesthetics, in terms of process, in terms of engagement of that.
Thank you. It was brilliant. And for me, I am sculptor and I see through materials. And it is important to think through the materials. And also you mentioned that scarcity of the material.
Scarcity of, sorry?
Scarcity of materials or not availability of the materials led you to make the materials. Can you talk more, or you are socially engaged, these present slide, can you talk more, or it is just one work you have done or more you have worked on, and what is your experience about that?
No, these are few selection of works from few of my series. So this is a kind of an practice which I work with. So there are, other projects are as well. But the thing is that I don't differentiate with the source of material, creating a material and creating an image. I look at the whole journey as my practice. It's not only creating an image, but it is the same important that how do I get those materials? Even it comes to chemical. Maybe looking for pigments, maybe looking for papers or fibers. So I think it's a collective knowledge. That is what I'm looking for. And I think by doing so, I gain knowledges which I'm looking for. And that collective knowledge comes through all of it. It doesn't come isolatedly. Image making is an isolated process. It comes if I get involved into the other aspects of it. And that is part of my research. Sourcing material, like one material which is not available in the market, so I will make it. It's not like that. But then I look at a chemical as a part of my practice. So a chemical may not be so valuable for the commercial printer who is making, let's say, platinum print. Ferric oxalate is an important chemical for them. But if I'm concentrated to make a platinum print only, I need that chemical from any source. But then when I look at the kind of an, let's say, if I collect the iron from my house or from somewhere, and then if I convert that iron to ferric oxalate through a process, then I have to do a research, I have to go through a methodology. And by doing so, I will rediscover the whole way of making it. And then finally, if I come to a point that where I make that platinum print, I think that is more rewarding than the thing. So it necessarily involves the process into it. I don't know how to share all of it or how to share it, but that is the complete picture. Image is not the complete picture only.
Varun, I was thinking when you immediately spoke of the rehearsal, of also the kind of absurdist theater which would exceptionalize the everydayness of an experience where nothing really happens, but suddenly that moment which you find curious or not so curious is exceptionalized through your framing of it. And I thought that's, for me, something that in one sense has spoken to Arpan, because one of the facets of your work that I found very interesting, and for anyone who has not been to Studio Gopo, you must go and spend some time with Arpan, is the absence, let's say the explicit absence that you make visible, I find often is your family. They enter your work, they enter your life, you enter their spaces, you make those spaces come to life with these chemicals. I've always wondered about your work, even including in IR 36, which actually the predominant aspect of that work, as I've discovered, it is the oral history that you've recorded alongside the visual history. Right? So those hours that you're spending looking out at spaces of space and acres of nothing is also about the choreography of the everyday. And that, in that lies the choreography. The absent part of that, I find, is also your life and your family that becomes your work. So I wanted you to talk a little bit about them. They play such a crucial role in your mise en scène, in your making of the image.
Absolutely, Rahav. Thank you for bringing up this issue. Yeah, actually, it's not me. It's my family, my dog, my parents, my kids, my partner, wife. The space where we live, the trees around, the birds around. All of it has a kind of a contribution to make it. So I personally believe that I live a life of an artist. And these are the residues of that life, with fragments of that life which comes around. And I probably resonate to that particular practice. Truly, I mean, this is the way how I live, how I spend my time. This is the way how I look around, look my neighbor, let's see. When a simple cauliflower leaf became important of my kitchen garden, because I found that what could be the best way to print my neighbor's portrait, that the best way could be the cauliflower leaf, which I grow and which I used to share with her. The Shantanadi, the first image which I showed. The Shantanadi passed away a few years back, and I found this archive of our family albums of our family somewhere in the bush. And then I thought, okay, let's print Shantanadi's portrait on a cauliflower leaf, which we used to share at certain point of time when she was there. So that became very important to me. I mean, it referred back to dewdrops. There's a very interesting poem by Tagore. It's called Shishir Bindu. And that's exactly talks about it. I have traveled everywhere, but then I forgot to look at what was happening just in front of my eyes. So I believe, I'm a very steady believer of that. I look at my family. They come often. You can see my daughter rehearsing the stage. It's an act of performance. And that performance goes on to a kind of a stage when, let's say, if I'm working with a process called calotype, which is a paper negative, which historically takes 8 minutes, 10 minutes of time of exposure, I can ask my daughter, okay, can you sit there for 10 minutes, stay still? And then the background was my village where things were moving. I was working there where things are all moving. So none of them been recorded except my daughter. And she stays there for 10 minutes. And it was almost a performance. Not almost, it was a performance in front of the camera. And I try to acknowledge that performance. Yeah, that's all. Thank you.